I'm not marrying you." The words detonated inside the cathedral, and Gabriel turned his back on Anastasia at the altar like the past year meant nothing. But as he walked down the aisle believing the job was finished, the massive doors behind him creaked open, and the one man who knew the truth about his plan was already walking toward him. Gabriel thought her father was dead. So why was Emilian Marin here? If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The cathedral bells rolled through the vaulted stone ceiling and settled in Anastasia's chest like a warning she didn't know how to read. She stood at the altar with her ivory bouquet gripped in both hands, the stems cool and damp against her palms, the cream roses trembling faintly with each unsteady breath she drew. The light inside the cathedral was extraordinary, golden and warm, streaming in thick, slanted columns through the stained glass high above, painting the ancient stone floor in amber and pale blue. It was the kind of light that made every moment feel significant, like something was about to happen. It was. Behind her, the pews were full. 93 guests, most of them dressed in the muted, careful elegance the occasion demanded, pressed suits in dark navy, pale blouses, small children already restless in the heat of the packed nave. The murmuring had begun long before it should have, not the gentle, anticipatory hum of a crowd moved by the beauty of a ceremony. This was something else. Lower. Anxious. The kind of sound a room makes when it has sensed something wrong before anyone dares to name it. Anastasia kept her eyes forward. Her father's chair was still empty. She told herself it was traffic. She told herself the convoy had been delayed. There was always construction near the East Bridge. Always some unavoidable thing between the house and the world. Her father was careful and methodical, and he had never once in her 26 years failed to appear when she needed him. She repeated this to herself quietly, the way a person holds a railing in the dark not because they expect to fall, but because the possibility has already occurred to them. At the front pew, little Katya stood in her cream tulle dress, the flower girl, 5 years old and utterly solemn, her small hands clasped over the basket of petals she had already scattered. She was watching the altar with the wide, uncomprehending attention of a child who knew the ceremony had gone quiet in a way that didn't match the morning's excitement. Her feet were perfectly still. She was the only one in the building who had stopped fidgeting. Anastasia's gaze drifted across the aisle. Gabriel stood opposite her in his dark suit, shoulders squared, jaw set. She had spent 14 months learning his face, the exact shade of warmth that entered his eyes when he was amused. The way his expression softened in the early morning before he was fully awake. The small, unconscious tilt of his head whenever she told a story he found interesting. She had believed she knew every version of him. The face he wore now was not one of them. Cold, precise, still in the way that still water is still because something underneath it has stopped moving. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself that men wore strange expressions at altars, that the weight of public vowing changed a person's face in ways that didn't mean anything. She had been doing this for almost an hour now, measuring, remeasuring, adjusting her conclusions so that none of them pointed anywhere alarming. The message that had arrived on her phone before she left the bridal suite, the one she had read 3 words of before pressing the screen face down against the vanity and walking out without looking back, pulsed now at the edge of her awareness like a bruise she was trying not to press. Behind her, a child whispered, then a sharp, hushing breath, then silence that was somehow louder than the murmuring had been. The priest stood to her left, his expression composed with the practiced gentleness of a man who had presided over enough human moments to recognize when one was collapsing. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Gabriel moved. Not forward, back. One deliberate step, then a second. His heels quiet on the ancient stone, his chin lifted, and for the first time since she had walked down this aisle toward him, his eyes found hers. They were flat. Final. The expression of a man who had already left and was only now allowing his body to follow. I can't do this. His voice rang through the cathedral with a clarity that had nothing accidental about it. Clear and even, and utterly without hesitation. The room inhaled as one. Anastasia's bouquet dipped in her hands. Somewhere in the middle pews, a woman made a strangled sound. The priest drew a careful breath beside her. Katya, at the front pew, looked up. What are you saying? Anastasia's voice came out smaller than she intended, exposed in a way that the cathedral's acoustics made worse. Carrying the words up into the vaulted arches and back down again, as if the building itself wanted everyone to hear her. "Gabriel, what are you saying?" He shook his head once, slowly, the gesture of a man concluding something he had been patient about for a long time. "I'm not marrying you." 93 people heard it. The whispers that followed were not gentle. They were the sound of an entire room recalibrating, re-understanding what it had gathered to witness. Chairs shifted. Voices broke through in fragments. Someone near the back said his name, sharp and disbelieving. Anastasia felt the bouquet slip. She tightened her grip and did not let it fall. She was aware of the stained glass above her, the warm gold light that had seemed so beautiful 20 minutes ago and now felt theatrical too bright, illuminating everything she would have preferred to keep invisible. Gabriel turned his back to the altar. He walked, long, unhurried strides down the center aisle, shoes steady on stone, the posture of a man who had no interest in looking back. The guests on either side turned to watch him pass faces, confused, then indignant, then stunned into a silence that pressed against the walls like something physical. A man in the third row reached out toward him. Gabriel didn't slow. Anastasia stood at the altar and did not move. She was aware, in a distant and strangely clinical way, that her hands were trembling, that the tears she had not yet allowed herself to cry were making the golden light blur at the edges, that Katya had stepped down from the pew and was standing very still in the aisle, watching Gabriel's retreating figure with an expression no child her age should have had to learn. The cathedral door at the far end of the nave swung open. The light that poured through was sharp and white, flooding the aisle from behind, throwing Gabriel's departing silhouette into sudden darkness. And through that brightness, unhurried, walked a man she had seen exactly once in her life. Tall, dark-haired, dressed entirely in black. He moved through the cathedral without asking the space for permission the way certain men move through any room, as though the architecture has already made accommodations for them. A tattoo traced the line of his neck above his collar. His eyes swept the nave in a single arc, taking inventory of everything in the space of one breath. They settled on Gabriel's back, and the expression on Emilian Marin's face was not surprise. It was the quiet, precise look of a man who had already known exactly what he would find, and had come anyway. Anastasia's grip on the bouquet finally loosened. One ivory rose fell to the cathedral floor. But to understand what Emilian Marin already knew and what it cost to know it, you have to go back before the cathedral, before the bells and the empty chair and the 3 words she hadn't finished reading, back to where the lie began. The first time Gabriel smiled at her, Anastasia had been standing in the rain. She hadn't planned to be outside. She had ducked out of her father's annual charity dinner for exactly 4 minutes, just long enough to breathe air that didn't taste like expensive cologne and careful conversation, and she had miscalculated the clouds. By the time the first drops hit her shoulders, she was already 3 steps too far from the entrance to pretend she hadn't noticed. She was wrestling with a small, completely inadequate evening bag when he appeared beside her with an umbrella, not offering it, simply holding it above her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though he had been standing there all along waiting for her to need it. "You looked like you were losing," he said. She had laughed before she meant to. That was how he did it. That was the first thing she would understand much later. Sitting in a cathedral with a fallen rose at her feet, that Gabriel had been extraordinary at locating the exact moment a person's guard came down, and stepping into it so smoothly that the movement felt like relief. His name was Gabriel Radu. He was charming in the particular way that careful men are charming, attentive without being suffocating, interested without being intrusive. He asked questions and remembered the answers. He called when he said he would call. He remembered that she took her coffee without sugar, that she preferred window seats on trains, that she found silence more comfortable than most people did. For 14 months, he was everything she had not known she was waiting for. She did not know that every question he asked was a door he was measuring, every dinner with her father, a room he was mapping, every conversation about security arrangements, about travel schedules, about which route the convoy used to reach the estate filed away with the patience and precision of a man who had been hired to collect exactly this information. Because Gabriel had not found her by accident, he had been sent. 3 years before that rain-soaked evening, a business arrangement had collapsed badly enough to leave several powerful men humiliated and a great deal of money unrecovered. The man they blamed was Anastasia's father, Nikolai, a figure known in certain circles for his influence and in others for his near-total invisibility. He moved rarely and without announcement. His estate was layered with security that had taken years to build. He trusted few people, and appeared in public fewer times than could be counted on one hand. He was, by every measure, unreachable, which meant that reaching him required a different kind of architecture entirely. The men who wanted him had tried the direct approach once. A vehicle, a stretch of road. 3 men with the kind of confidence that comes from never having failed yet. They had failed. Nikolai's security team had handled it, without involving the police, without involving the press, and without Nikolai missing a single scheduled meeting. After that, the approach changed. "Find the daughter," one of them had said, at a meeting that took place in a room with no windows and was never recorded. "She goes out. She has a life. She believes in people. Use that." Gabriel had been the obvious choice. Educated, controlled, fluent in 3 languages, and the specific dialect of old money that Anastasia had grown up speaking. He had done similar work before. Quieter work, slower work, the kind that required a particular ability to perform warmth over long periods of time, without allowing anything real to bleed through. He had understood the assignment completely. Get close, build trust, wait for the one occasion when Nikolai would have no choice but to step outside his fortress and appear in public surrounded by guests, by cameras, by the softness of a celebration. A father would always come to his daughter's wedding. What Gabriel had not accounted for was the specific texture of the 14 months that followed. Not the feelings he had managed those with clinical efficiency, sealing them behind the performance with the practiced ease of someone who had done it before. But the proximity, the accumulating weight of ordinary moments, Anastasia handing him a coffee in the morning and turning away without expecting anything in return. Anastasia at her father's dinner table, watching Nikolai with the particular attentiveness of a daughter who knows her parent is aging and has decided not to look away from it. Anastasia on the phone with her father late at night, her voice dropping to something softer, something private, something that had no audience and wasn't performing for one. Gabriel had watched all of it and catalogued none of it. That was what he told himself, and for 14 months he had been mostly right. The wedding date was set in the early spring. He had relayed the information the same evening message sent from the bathroom of the restaurant, where Anastasia had said yes, tears on her face and her father's ring on her hand, because Nikolai had given him the family ring, and Gabriel had understood that this was the detail that would make it irreversible. The reply had come back in under a minute. "Good. Don't contact us again until the morning of." He hadn't. He had instead spent 4 more months inside a life that belonged to someone else, sleeping in the quiet of a house that trusted him, eating at a table that included him, learning the names of Anastasia's childhood friends, and the specific way her expression changed when her father entered a room, a particular brightening, unguarded and immediate, the face of a woman who had never once doubted she was loved. On the morning of the wedding, he had dressed carefully. He had looked at himself in the mirror for a long time, and then he had picked up his phone and sent the final message. "Today, he'll be in the convoy by 10. Watch the East Road." He had put the phone in his jacket pocket and walked out of the room without looking back at the bed, or the coffee cup she had left on the nightstand, or the small framed photograph of the 2 of them that she had placed on the dresser sometime in the last year, without making any announcement about it at all. He had not allowed himself to look at any of it. Some doors, Gabriel understood, were only safe if you never opened them. He had kept that one closed, all the way to the altar. Nikolai Vasile had a rule about doors. Every door in his estate had a different lock. Not for security, though security was part of it, but because he believed that access should always be deliberate. That the act of choosing a key, of selecting the correct one from the ring, of committing to the specific mechanism of a specific door, made a person pause. Made them think about where they were going and why. Anastasia had grown up in a house full of pauses. She had not always understood them. As a child, she had found it maddening, the stillness of the estate, the way conversations stopped when certain phones rang, the men who stood at certain corners of the property without ever explaining why they were standing there. She had asked her mother once, at 7 years old, why their house was so quiet. Her mother had smoothed her hair and said, "Because your father worked very hard to make it that way." Her mother was gone now 11 years in the ground, a loss that had folded Nikolai inward in ways that even Anastasia could not always reach. But the quietness of the house had never left. It had only deepened, year by year, becoming less the silence of caution and more the silence of a man who had decided that the world outside his walls asked more of him than he was willing to give. Nikolai appeared in public 4 times in the past 3 years. Anastasia knew the exact number because she had been present for all 4 occasions and had understood, each time, the weight of the concession he was making. A board meeting that required his physical presence for legal reasons. A funeral for a man who had once saved his life and therefore could not be honored by a card or a proxy. A dinner that had taken 6 months of negotiation to arrange and which 3 governments had an interest in. And once, just once, her university graduation, which he had attended in a dark coat and left before the photographs, slipping away with the quiet efficiency of a man who had already calculated exactly how long exposure was acceptable. He had hugged her before he left, long enough that she felt the tension in his shoulders and understood it for what it was: not reluctance to hold her, but the permanent vigilance of a man who had learned that stillness in a crowd was a different thing entirely from stillness at home. "You came," she had said against his shoulder, because she hadn't been certain he would. "You thought I wouldn't?" he had said, and the surprise in his voice was so genuine that she had laughed. Gabriel had met Nikolai twice. The first time was at the estate, 8 months into the relationship. A Sunday dinner that Anastasia had described as casual, and which had been neither casual nor a dinner so much as a structured evaluation conducted over 3 courses and excellent wine. Nikolai had asked Gabriel 4 questions. Not the questions a father typically asked, not about career or intentions or family background. Different questions. Quiet, careful questions about things that had nothing obviously to do with anything, asked in the gentle tone of a man who had no particular interest in the answers. Gabriel had understood, even then, that the questions were not the test. The pauses between his answers were. He had passed. He had known he would. He had been trained for precisely this kind of room. But afterward, driving away from the estate with Anastasia's hand in his, and the gate closing in the rearview mirror, he had felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, something that felt uncomfortably like respect. He had buried it immediately. The second meeting was 3 months later, a brief, unplanned overlap when Nikolai arrived home early and found Gabriel in the kitchen with Anastasia, the 2 of them arguing cheerfully about whether the recipe she was attempting was ambitious or catastrophically overconfident. Nikolai had stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them without announcement. Then he had said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She laughs more," and walked upstairs without further comment. Anastasia had glowed for the rest of the evening. Gabriel had said nothing. When Anastasia told her father the wedding date, they were sitting in his study, a room she had loved since childhood for its smell of old paper and cedar, for the particular amber light of the desk lamp, for the bookshelves that lined every wall, and which she had always suspected contained at least some volumes he had never opened, and simply liked the presence of. Nikolai had listened to her with the quality of attention he gave to everything complete, unhurried, as though no other moment existed outside this one. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You're certain," he said. "Not a question, a measurement." "I'm certain," she said. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, as though he were calculating something complicated and arriving at an answer he was not entirely at peace with. Then his expression softened in the specific way it only ever softened for her, a gradual unlocking, and he reached across the desk and covered her hand with his. "Then I'll be there," he said. Every step. She had squeezed his hand and not said what she was thinking, which was that she had not realized until that moment how frightened she had been that he might not come, that the fortress he had built around his life might finally be too thick to step through, even for this. He had squeezed back, as if he'd heard it anyway. That evening, Nikolai made 2 calls. The first was to his security team, to begin arranging the convoy route and the advance detail for the cathedral. The second was to a man he had not spoken to in 4 months, because 4 months of silence between them was unremarkable, the natural rhythm of a friendship built in rooms that didn't exist on any record. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. "The wedding is the 23rd, Nikolai said. A pause. "I'll be there," said Emilian Marin. Another pause. Shorter. "Bring enough men," Nikolai said. Not a request. Emilian didn't answer that. He didn't need to. He simply ended the call the way he ended most things, without ceremony, without waste, in the precise moment when everything necessary had already been said. Outside the estate, the evening was very still. The gate was locked. All the right doors were closed. But somewhere across the city, a phone screen lit up with a single outgoing message sent from Gabriel's number to a contact saved under no name at all. "The wedding is confirmed. 23rd. He'll come." There were very few people alive who called Emilian Marin by his first name. Not because he demanded formality, he had no particular interest in titles or the performance of hierarchy that other men in his position seemed to require. It was something else. Something in the quality of his stillness, in the way he occupied a room without announcing himself, that made people instinctively reach for distance, as though proximity carried a cost that most were unwilling to pay without being certain of the exchange. Nikolai had called him Emelian since the night they met, 22 years ago, in a situation that neither of them discussed, and both of them remembered with the particular clarity reserved for moments that divide a life into before and after. That was the whole of the origin story, as far as anyone else was ever permitted to know it. What it had produced was something rarer than alliance and more durable than debt. Not friendship in the way the word was commonly used, not warmth or regularity, or the easy shorthand of people who had chosen each other in ordinary circumstances. More like the understanding between two structures that have been tested by the same storm. Each knew what the other was made of. Neither had ever been surprised by the other in a way that mattered. When Nikolai called about the wedding, Emelian had been in the middle of nothing in particular, sitting at the long window of his apartment with a glass of water and the specific quality of silence he maintained around himself like a perimeter. He had listened to Nikolai's voice and heard, underneath the words, the thing Nikolai was not saying. "I am stepping outside the walls. I will need someone I trust at my back." He had said he would come without hesitation. On the morning of the 23rd, Emelian dressed without ceremony. Black suit. No tie. The jacket cut to conceal what it needed to conceal. He checked his phone once, 3 messages from members of his team confirming their positions, and pocketed it without replying. His driver was waiting in the courtyard below. The city was still quiet at that hour, the streets running clean and pale in the early light. The cathedral district not yet fully awake. Emelian sat in the back of the vehicle and watched the buildings pass with the expression he wore in all moving vehicles, alert in a way that appeared, to the casual observer, like boredom. It was not boredom. It was the practiced stillness of a man whose particular skill set had been built on the ability to notice the thing that was wrong before it had finished being wrong. An education earned not in any formal setting but across 20 years of rooms and roads and situations that had demanded, each time, that he be the first person in the space to understand what was actually happening. They were 12 minutes from the cathedral when he noticed the vehicles. 2 of them, dark, maintaining a gap that was just slightly too consistent to be coincidental, close enough to keep the convoy in sight, far enough to suggest the awareness that they themselves might be watched. Amateur spacing. The kind of distance that looked careful to someone who had never done it, and looked obvious to someone who had done it badly once, and learned. Emelian said nothing for approximately 4 seconds. Then he picked up his phone. "We have a tail," he said. 2 vehicles, gray saloon and a black panel van, hanging at 200 meters. Alert the convoy and tell Nikolai's team to hold speed. Do not accelerate, do not deviate. I want them to believe we haven't seen them. He ended the call and looked out the window again. The gray saloon was still there. Of course it was. What followed was not prolonged. Emelian had no interest in prolonged. Prolonged created variables, and variables created the specific kind of disorder he had spent 2 decades learning to prevent. He made 2 more calls in the space of 90 seconds. By the time the convoy turned onto the quieter road that ran alongside the river, a route that had been selected, Emelian now understood, by someone who had known exactly which road offered the least witnesses, his own vehicles were already in position. The ambush lasted less than 4 minutes. 6 men. Coordinated enough to suggest prior planning, undisciplined enough in execution to suggest the plan had assumed less resistance than it encountered. The gray saloon moved first, cutting across the convoy's front. The panel van came from a side street, accelerating hard. Neither made it to Nikolai's vehicle. Emelian's men were already out of the follow cars before the van's doors opened. There was a brief, sharp exchange that Emelian observed from his window, with the same flat attention he gave to most things, noting what was working, noting what wasn't, adjusting the variables he could reach by phone in real time, until the roadside was quiet again, and 6 men were restrained on the ground, and Nikolai's vehicle had stopped 20 meters ahead, with its security team fanned around it in a perimeter. Emelian stepped out of his car. He walked to the convoy without hurry. Nikolai was in the back seat, upright, conscious. A cut above his left eyebrow from the impact of the van's first contact, and a pressure dressing already being applied by his security lead. His expression, when Emelian opened the door, was the expression of a man who had been in bad situations before, and was currently performing an internal assessment of how bad this one was. The girl. was the first thing Nikolai said. Doesn't know yet, Emelian said. She's at the cathedral. Nikolai closed his eyes briefly. One breath. Go, he said. Emelian was already turning. Behind him, one of his men was moving through the restrained attackers with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done this before, checking phones, checking pockets, working quickly and without commentary. Emelian. He stopped. His man was holding up a phone. Screen lit. A message thread open. A name at the top of the conversation that made Emelian go very still for a moment, not with surprise, but with the particular quality of recognition that arrives when a shape you have been half seeing finally sharpens into something you can name. He took the phone. He read the message. Today. He'll be in the convoy by 10. Watch the East Road. The sender's contact name was saved simply as G. Emelian stood at the side of that quiet road, the distant cathedral bells just audible in the morning air, and read the message one more time. Then he typed a single word into the reply field and pressed send. Done. He handed the phone back to his man, buttoned his jacket, and walked to his car. The cathedral was 11 minutes away. He told his driver to make it 8. The East Road ran alongside the river for exactly 1 kilometer before it narrowed. That was the detail that mattered. 1 kilometer of open water on the left, a stone retaining wall on the right, and a road width that reduced from 2 lanes to 1 at the point where the old bridge abutment had never been fully demolished. Whoever had chosen this stretch had chosen it with knowledge, not the general knowledge of a person who had driven it once, but the specific, patient knowledge of someone who had walked it, measured it, stood at the narrow point and looked back along the approach and understood exactly what the geometry offered. A funnel. No exit left, no exit right. Forward momentum interrupted by the bottleneck and anything behind them cut off by whatever moved to block the rear. It was, Emelian had to acknowledge, a competent choice. He had identified it as the likely point 7 minutes before they reached it. The convoy comprised 3 vehicles, Nikolai's car in the center, a heavy dark saloon with reinforced panels and glass rated against small arms, a security vehicle ahead and one behind, each carrying 4 men. Standard formation for a principal who did not travel often and whose team was professional without being the kind of professional that came from years of active field work. Good men, trained men, but trained for deterrence, primarily, for the visible presence that made most threats recalculate before they materialized. This threat had already done its calculating. Emelian's car ran parallel, 1 street east, maintaining pace through the quieter residential road that mirrored the river route. His driver had done this before, not this specific scenario, but the general shape of it, the careful mirroring of a principal's route, while maintaining the distance that kept the follow car invisible to anyone watching the convoy, and not the surrounding grid. At 200 meters, the gray saloon was still holding position. At 150, the panel van reappeared from a side street 2 blocks ahead and slotted into traffic with the specific awkwardness of a large vehicle being driven by someone managing nerves alongside a steering wheel. Emelian noted the van's positioning, calculated the timing. He made the first call. 30 seconds, he said. Move on my word. The gray saloon went first. It accelerated hard past the convoy's lead vehicle and cut across the road at the narrow point, angling sideways to block the full width of the lane. The driver knew what he was doing. The handbrake turn was clean, the vehicle settling broadside across the road, with the engine still running, and 2 doors already opening before it had fully stopped. Behind the convoy, the panel van surged forward. Inside Nikolai's car, the security lead was already on the radio-controlled voice, clipped words, the professional register of a man doing exactly what his training said to do. The convoy stopped. The outer security vehicles locked their doors. The perimeter protocol began to execute. And then Emelian said the word. 4 vehicles came from 3 directions simultaneously, 2 from the residential street to the east, cutting through the gap between buildings at speed, 1 from ahead that had been holding position at the next intersection, under no instruction except wait, and 1 from behind that had been sitting parked on the river road for 40 minutes, with its engine off and its occupants doing nothing that would have alarmed any observer. What followed had the compressed, disorienting quality of all events that are over before the mind has finished understanding that they have begun. The 6 men from the saloon and the van had expected resistance. They had not expected to be outnumbered before their feet were fully on the ground. The first 2 were restrained at the saloon before either had cleared their jackets. The van's side door opened onto 3 of Emelian's men already standing at the step, which produced a silence so complete and so immediate that the two men inside made the correct calculation without requiring persuasion. The sixth man ran. He made it 40 meters along the river wall before he was collected with the quiet efficiency of a team that had anticipated exactly this, because there was always one who ran. And the exit along the river wall was the only exit available. And Emilian had put a man there 20 minutes ago precisely because obvious exits required coverage. 4 minutes and 11 seconds from the first vehicle moving, the road was still again. 6 men on the ground. Emilian's people working through them quickly and without conversation, the practiced silence of a team that had learned to communicate in shorthand and movement, rather than words. Emilian walked the perimeter once, noting everything, adjusting nothing because there was nothing that required adjusting. Then he walked to Nikolai's car. The door opened before he reached it. Nikolai was already sitting forward, one hand pressed to the left side of his head, where the impact of the van's contact, a glancing blow to the convoy's rear quarter, that had been harder than it appeared from outside, had caught him against the blow. Window. The cut above his eyebrow was clean but deep, the kind of cut that produced a quantity of blood disproportionate to its actual severity, and the security lead was pressing a folded cloth against it with the focused attention of a man determined not to let this become worse than it already was. Nikolai's eyes, when they found Emilian, were clear. That was the first thing Emilian checked. Always the eyes first. "How many?" Nikolai said. Not a question about his own condition, a question about the road. 6. All contained. Nikolai absorbed this. His jaw tightened once. Professional, competent planning, poor execution. Emilian paused. Someone gave them the route. The silence between them carried the weight of that sentence for a moment. "Anastasia doesn't know," Nikolai said. "No, she's at the cathedral." "Yes." Nikolai looked at him steadily, the look of a man performing an internal calculation that had only one possible answer, and was taking one final moment before committing to it. The cloth against his eyebrow had darkened. Somewhere behind them, a radio crackled quietly. The river moved indifferently alongside the wall. "Then we already know what this was for," Nikolai said. Emilian said nothing, because they did. The wedding was not the celebration, it was the trap. And somewhere inside that cathedral, dressed in a dark suit and standing at an altar he had never intended to honor, the man who had built it was still waiting for confirmation that it had worked. The phone was a cheap thing. Prepaid. The kind purchased with cash from a shop that didn't ask questions and discarded after a single use by anyone who understood the basic arithmetic of exposure. It had been in the inside pocket of the third man Emilian's team had worked through, not the first, which would have been careless, and not the last, which would have suggested it was hidden. The third, tucked into a jacket lining with the specific deliberateness of someone who had been told exactly where to carry it and why. Emilian turned it over in his hand once. The screen was cracked along the lower left corner. The case was black and generic, and had the faint warmth of a device that had been held recently, nervously, by someone who had been checking it at intervals for most of the morning. There were 3 messages in the thread. No contact name, just a number. He read them in order. The first, sent 4 days ago. Confirmed. Cathedral, 23rd. Convoy leaves the estate at 9:45, East Road to the River Bridge. The second, sent this morning at 7:12. Stay close to the saloon. Don't move until the van commits. The third, sent 40 minutes ago, the most recent, time-stamped while the convoy was still navigating the city's outer roads. Is it done? I need confirmation before I leave the church. Emilian read the third message twice, not because he hadn't understood it the first time. Because understanding it and allowing it to fully land were 2 different things, and he permitted himself exactly the time it took to read 7 words twice, before he sealed whatever he was feeling behind the expression he wore in all circumstances that required him to function. Before I leave the church. Inside the church. Already there, already standing at that altar with Anastasia beside him, already occupying the position of a man preparing to marry her, while simultaneously monitoring a phone for news of her father's death. The architecture of it was complete, elegant, in the way that thoroughly ugly things are sometimes elegant, precise, interlocking, each piece dependent on the others. Gabriel at the altar to confirm the mission was active. The East Road selected by someone with access to Nikolai's convoy route. The wedding as the mechanism that forced Nikolai into the open, and the reply the confirmation as Gabriel's signal to walk away. To walk away from the altar, from Anastasia, from the entire fabricated year, the moment he knew the principal was dead, Emilian stood on that quiet road with the river moving alongside him, and the 6 contained men and his own team working steadily around him. And he held the phone and was still for a moment that was longer than his stillness usually was. Then he typed one word into the reply field. Done. He pressed send. Watched the delivery indicator change. Put the phone in his own jacket pocket. He returned to Nikolai's car. The security lead had the situation managed. Pressure applied. A medical team already dispatched, and 12 minutes out, the immediate threat fully neutralized, and the scene being documented with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that evidence had value and chaos did not. Nikolai was sitting upright, the cloth at his temple, his color returning by degrees. The phone, Emilian said, and showed him the message thread without preamble. Nikolai read it. Once. His face did not change in any dramatic way, no collapse, no visible shock. The reaction of a man whose relationship with betrayal was old enough to have become, if not comfortable, at least familiar in its outlines. But something shifted behind his eyes. Something that had nothing to do with strategy or calculation, and everything to do with the fact that for 8 months this man had sat at his table, had held his daughter's hand across a dinner he had been careful to make welcoming, had been given the family ring. He sent them the route, Nikolai said, flat, certain, and the timing, and the road. Emilian paused. He's been inside for over a year. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man absorbing something that could not be unabsorbed. Anastasia, Nikolai said, she doesn't know any of it. She's standing at that altar. Yes. Nikolai's hand tightened once on the doorframe. One, controlled, deliberate tightening, a man using physical pressure to manage what he could not otherwise manage in this particular moment, in this particular vehicle, with a cut above his eye and the full understanding settling over him of what his daughter had been used for, what she was still being used for, what she was standing in right now, in her white dress with her ivory roses, waiting for a man who had already sent the order to kill her father and was now waiting for the reply that would tell him the job was finished. He sent the reply, Emilian said, from this phone, 30 seconds ago. Nikolai looked at him. He thinks it's done, Emilian said. A pause, which means he's about to move. Nikolai understood immediately because Nikolai always understood immediately. It was the quality Emilian had respected in him since the beginning. The speed of his comprehension, the way he processed and arrived without requiring the intermediate steps spelled out. Gabriel's exit was conditional on confirmation. He had the confirmation now. He would not wait in that cathedral a moment longer than the plan required. He would leave. Cleanly, quickly, with the performance already concluded, and no further reason to maintain it. He would leave Anastasia at that altar, in front of 93 people, and walk out of the cathedral, and out of her life without a backward look, because that was what the plan required. And Gabriel, Emilian now understood completely, had been following the plan with the same discipline and the same absence of conscience for every single day of the 14 months he had spent building the lie. Emilian stood up from the car door. I need a vehicle, he said to his driver. Ready. He looked at Nikolai once more, the direct, steady look of a man making a commitment that didn't require words, because the words were already understood between them. Nikolai gave him the smallest nod. Emilian buttoned his jacket, walked to the waiting car. The cathedral was 8 minutes away. He had already told his driver to make it 5. The phone vibrated once in Gabriel's jacket pocket. He felt it against his chest like a heartbeat that wasn't his, a single brief pulse that carried more information than most conversations managed in an hour. He did not reach for it immediately. He was standing at the altar, and reaching for a phone at an altar was the kind of detail that lodged in people's memories, the kind that got described afterward to people who hadn't been present, and Gabriel had not spent 14 months managing details this carefully to become careless in the final 3 minutes. He waited. Anastasia was beside him. He was aware of her the way he had trained himself to be aware of her peripherally, functionally, as a variable in the immediate environment, rather than a person with a particular way of exhaling when she was trying not to cry, which was a detail he had not asked to know and had known for 11 months regardless. He waited another 30 seconds. Then he reached into his pocket, with the casual unhurriedness of a man checking the time, angled the screen away from the priest and the front pews, and read the message. Done. 1 word. He read it once, slid the phone back into his pocket, looked at the stained glass above the altar for exactly 2 seconds, not for any sentimental reason, simply because 2 seconds was the interval his body required to complete the transition from one operational mode to the next. Then he stepped back from the altar. What happened in the following 4 minutes would be described differently by every person in the cathedral, depending on where they were sitting and what they had been watching and what their relationship was to the two people at the center of it. But every account would contain the same 3 beats, in the same order, without variation. The step back, the words, the walk. The step back was what silenced the room first, not the words, which came after, but the physical fact of Gabriel moving away from the altar with a deliberateness that had no ceremonial explanation. The priest noticed it first, and made a small involuntary adjustment of his own posture. The instinctive recalibration of a man whose professional experience had given him a finely tuned sensitivity to moments departing from their expected shape. The guests nearest the front caught it next. A ripple of attention, sharpening row by row, the way a congregation's collective focus shifts when the thing they came to witness is no longer behaving like the thing they came to witness. Anastasia turned to look at him. Gabriel met her eyes for the first time since she had walked down the aisle, and he held her gaze for exactly as long as was necessary, which was long enough for her to see that the warmth she had been searching for all morning was not hidden or suppressed or managed by nerves. It had never been there. "I can't do this," he said. The silence that followed was the most complete silence the cathedral had produced all morning, deeper than the hush before the ceremony began, deeper than the pauses between the organ's phrases. The silence of a room that has heard something it needs a moment to process before it can react. Anastasia's voice, when it came, was quiet. "What are you saying?" Gabriel looked at her and said nothing. Gabriel. Steadier now, the steadiness of a woman pressing every resource she had against something she could feel, but could not yet see the full shape of. "What are you saying to me? I'm not marrying you." He said it clearly. Loudly enough for the front 4 rows to hear without question, and quietly enough that the rows beyond would lean forward to confirm what they thought they'd heard, which meant the information would reach every corner of the cathedral within seconds, passed along in the urgent, horrified shorthand of people who understood they were witnessing something that could not be taken back. The room erupted. Not loudly, not in the way of crowds that have witnessed something joyful or frightening, in the way of crowds that have witnessed something deeply, privately wrong. Whispers that had the texture of shock. Murmured names. A woman in the 4th row pressing her hand to her mouth. A man near the aisle standing up halfway, then sitting back down. The instinct to intervene meeting the paralysis of not knowing what intervention would look like here. Anastasia stood at the altar and did not move. The bouquet trembled in her hands, her eyes dark, steady. The eyes of a woman who had learned composure from a father who wore it like a second skin, were filling in a way she was visibly, desperately trying to prevent. Not from vanity, not from the audience, but from the specific refusal of a person who is not ready to let what is happening to them be completely real yet. "What are you talking about?" Her voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly, just enough. Gabriel didn't answer. He had nothing to say to her that the plan required. The plan required departure. Clean, immediate, unhesitating departure, timed to the confirmation he had received, executed before anyone in this building had the presence of mind to physically obstruct it. He turned. The movement was smooth and final, the turn of a man who has already completed this action internally and is now simply allowing the physical world to catch up. He straightened his jacket once with both hands, an unconscious gesture of a particular revealing kind, the gesture of a man returning to himself after a long performance, and began walking down the aisle. His shoes were steady on the stone. He did not look at the guests as he passed them, though he was aware of them, the faces turning, the sounds cresting around him. A man reaching out from the 3rd row whose hand Gabriel stepped past without acknowledgement. He was aware of Katya at the front pew, very small and very still in her cream dress, watching him with the uncomplicated, devastating clarity of a child who did not yet know how to disguise what she was seeing. He did not look back at the altar. He did not look back at Anastasia. He was 15 meters from the cathedral doors, close enough to see the iron handles, close enough to begin calculating the 12 steps that remained between him and the exit, and the waiting car, and the rest of a life that would resume the moment he cleared this building. The doors opened, not from his hand. From the outside, the light that entered was white and absolute, flooding the aisle in a way that stopped Gabriel mid-stride for a single involuntary second. The instinctive hesitation of a body encountering the unexpected before the mind has issued instructions. A figure moved through the light. Tall, dark, unhurried. Gabriel's mind performed the calculation before his expression had time to respond to it. The height, the build, the particular quality of stillness in motion, the dark suit and the ink visible above the collar, and the eyes that found him across the length of the cathedral and did not move from him again. Emilian Marin, alive. Gabriel's next step did not come. The two men stood 40 meters apart, in a cathedral full of people, and the distance between them had the quality of a held breath, enormous, pressurized, containing everything that was about to happen in the space of what had not happened yet. Gabriel's next step did not come. He understood, in the compressed and clarifying way that danger produces understanding, that the calculation he had been running for the past 14 months had just encountered a variable it had not accounted for. The variable was standing in the cathedral doorway, with white light behind him, buttoning nothing, adjusting nothing, simply looking at Gabriel across the length of the nave with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had already decided how this ended and was in no particular rush about the mechanics. Emilian Marin walked forward. He moved down the aisle the way he moved through all spaces, without announcement, without aggression, the dangerous stillness of a man whose stillness itself was the message. His eyes did not leave Gabriel. They did not flicker to the guests, to the altar, to the priest, to the small flower girl in cream tulle who had pressed herself against the front pew and was watching with enormous, unblinking eyes. They stayed on Gabriel with the fixed, calibrated attention of someone who had walked into rooms like this before, and understood that the only variable requiring active management was the one currently standing 15 meters from the exit. Gabriel ran the calculation again. The doors were behind Emilian now. 3 of Emilian's men had entered behind him and positioned themselves with the quiet efficiency of people who did not need to be told where to stand. 1 at the doors, 1 at the side aisle to the left, 1 moving along the right with the unhurried pace of a man who was not hurrying because he didn't need to. The geometry of the room had reorganized itself in the space of 12 seconds, and every exit Gabriel's mind reached for had a body in it. He turned. Forward was the altar, Anastasia, the priest, a wall of stone beyond them, and no door. Behind him was Emilian. The side aisles were covered. Gabriel was still performing the calculation when he stopped performing it, because there was a point at which continuing to calculate was itself a decision, and the decision it communicated to anyone watching was exactly the kind of decision he could not afford to communicate right now. He needed to think. He needed 30 seconds and 4 meters of unobserved space, and neither of those things was available in this cathedral. He did not get them. Emilian stopped walking when there were 10 meters between them. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Gabriel with the expression he had worn since entering flat, certain, the expression of a man in possession of more information than the person opposite him, and entirely comfortable with that asymmetry. The cathedral had gone completely silent. 93 guests who had come to witness a wedding were now witnessing something they did not have a category for. The ceremony had already broken. The groom had already refused. And now a dark-haired man in a black suit had walked through the doors and stopped in the middle of the aisle and was looking at the groom with an expression that made several people in the front rows quietly decide to remain exactly where they were. Katya had not moved. She stood at the end of the front pew with her basket of spent petals and watched Emilian with the same solemn, uncategorizing attention she had given to everything this morning. She did not appear frightened. She appeared to be waiting to understand what she was seeing, with the patience of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she understood things before she did. Anastasia was at the altar. She had not moved since Gabriel turned his back on her. She was still holding the bouquet one-handed now, the stems gripped at her side, rather than held in ceremony, the posture of a woman who had forgotten she was holding it. Her eyes had found Emilian the moment he entered, and they stayed on him with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, confusion and something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it in the way that any unknown quantity is adjacent to hope, when the known quantities have all turned out to be catastrophic. She did not know why he was here. She did not know what was happening. But she knew her father had not arrived, and she knew that Emilian was her father's closest friend, and she knew, with the particular instinct of a person whose body has been processing information that their mind has been refusing to accept all morning, that these two facts were connected in a way she was not yet ready to fully understand. Emilian spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform the words for the audience, did not address the cathedral or the guests or the occasion. He spoke to Gabriel in the direct, even register of a man completing a conversation that had already begun elsewhere. "The men on the East Road have been collected," he said. "The phone has been collected. The message thread going back 4 days has been read. A pause, brief and deliberate. Your contact replied an hour ago from a different phone than the one you were expecting. Gabriel said nothing. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone to the calculation again. The doors, the aisles, the geometry of the room, and Emilian watched him do it with the same flat patience. "There's nowhere in this building," Emilian said simply. Gabriel looked at him. "Nikolai is alive," Emilian said. Something moved across Gabriel's face. Not guilt. It was too fast and too controlled for guilt, which required a kind of openness that Gabriel had spent 14 months sealing shut. It was closer to the expression of a man receiving confirmation of a loss he had already factored in as a possibility, and was now adjusting his remaining options around, which told Emilian everything he needed to know about who he was looking at. He nodded once to the man at the right aisle. It happened quickly. Gabriel moved first, a sharp pivot toward the left aisle, the decision of a man who has run out of calculations and defaulted to the oldest option available, which was simply to move and keep moving and manage the consequences of movement as they arrived. He was fast. He had the specific, economical speed of someone trained for exactly this kind of exit. Not athletic in any showy sense, just efficient. The minimum energy required to cover maximum ground. He covered 4 meters. Then 2 of Emilian's men were on him, and the efficiency of that was of an entirely different order, the practiced, almost tedious efficiency of people who had done this many times and found nothing remarkable about it, who understood the body's architecture and its leverage points with the clinical familiarity of long experience. Gabriel went down onto the cathedral floor. The sound of it carried through the stone nave and into the vaulted ceiling, and back down into the silence of 93 people who had not made a sound in nearly 2 minutes. A woman in the middle pews finally began to cry, not loudly, just the helpless, overwhelmed crying of someone whose nervous system had been holding something difficult for too long, and had found its release point in the sudden concrete reality of a man on the floor of a church. Gabriel was restrained, efficiently, without drama, in the manner of people for whom restraint was procedural rather than personal. He did not struggle beyond the first 3 seconds. Emilian walked the remaining distance and stood over him, not looming, not performing dominance for the audience, simply standing in the way that he stood in all circumstances, which was as though the ground beneath him belonged to him by right of having understood it better than anyone else in the vicinity. He looked down at Gabriel for a moment. Gabriel looked back up at him from the cathedral floor, with the expression of a man who had lost and knew it, and was now engaged in the final calculation available to him, which was how to manage what came next. Emilian reached into his jacket pocket and held up the prepaid phone. He held it in the space between them long enough for Gabriel to identify it. Long enough for the specific recognition to cross Gabriel's face, not of the phone itself, but of what its presence in Emilian's hand meant, which was the complete and irreversible collapse of every structure Gabriel had spent 14 months building. Then Emilian turned away from him. He walked back down the aisle toward the altar, unhurried, straight, his eyes moving to Anastasia now for the first time since he'd entered, finding her where she stood, with the loosened bouquet, and the expression of a woman standing at the exact boundary between what she had believed this morning and what she was about to be told. He stopped at the foot of the altar steps. He looked at her steadily. "Your father is alive," he said. "He's been injured. He is being treated and he is stable, and he asked me to come here directly." A pause. "There are things you need to know. I'll tell you all of it. But I need you to hear first that he is alive." Anastasia's bouquet hit the altar steps. Her hand went to her mouth, and the breath she released was the kind that only comes after a person has been holding something unbearable without knowing they were holding it long, ragged, the sound of a body letting go of a weight it had been carrying since the moment it understood the weight existed. Katya, at the front pew, quietly sat down. The cathedral had not emptied. It should have, in any ordinary sequence of events, the arrival of armed men and a body on the floor would have produced the immediate, instinctive exit of everyone present who had not been specifically asked to stay. But ordinary sequence had ceased to apply to this building approximately 40 minutes ago, and the 93 people in the pews had crossed a threshold somewhere in the past hour, beyond which leaving felt less like safety and more like abandonment. They stayed, not from morbid curiosity or not only from that, but because the woman standing at the altar steps was someone most of them had known since she was a child, someone they had watched grow up in the specific, careful way that the daughter of a powerful and protected man grows up aware of the walls around her even when she couldn't see them, loved by a father who expressed it through presence rather than words. They had come to celebrate her. The celebration had become something else entirely. But she was still there, and leaving felt like a second desertion in a morning that had already held one. Emilian was aware of the room. He was always aware of the room. He looked at Anastasia and made a quiet, considered decision about what she needed in the next 60 seconds before he told her anything else, which was to not be standing at an altar in a wedding dress in front of everyone who had watched her be humiliated and then terrified in the space of a single morning. He turned to the priest, who had not moved from his position through any of it, and whose composure Emilian noted with genuine if unexpressed respect. "Is there a room?" Emilian said. Not a question. The priest moved without further discussion. The vestry was small and stone-walled, and smelled of old wood and candle wax, a narrow room off the side of the chancel with a table and 4 chairs, and the particular deep quiet of a space that had absorbed a great deal of human weight over a very long time. Emilian brought Anastasia here, and the priest closed the door behind them without being asked to. She sat. She had stopped crying in the way that people stop when there is more information coming, and the body understands it needs its resources. Her eyes were red and completely steady. The bouquet was gone. She had set it on the altar steps and not retrieved it, and Emilian had not suggested she should. Gabriel had been removed from the cathedral floor. 2 of Emilian's men had taken him to a vehicle outside efficiently, without theater, without the performance of force that would have given the watching guests more than they needed to process. He had gone without resistance, which Emilian noted and filed, because men who stopped resisting were either managing themselves carefully or had moved past resistance into something quieter and more complicated, and both required attention. Emilian sat across from Anastasia and told her. He told her in the order that the information needed to be received: the convoy first, the ambush, her father's injury, the confirmation that the medical team had reached him and that the wound was serious but not critical, that Nikolai was in the back of a secure vehicle, and that Emilian had spoken to him 12 minutes ago, and the instruction had been to come here and tell Anastasia himself, directly, before she heard anything else from anyone else. She listened without interrupting. This was the quality in her that reminded Emilian most of her father. Not the composure, which she had learned, but the listening. The complete, unhurried reception of information before judgment, before response, before the visible processing began. It was not a quality most people had. It required a kind of interior stillness that was either innate or built through years of learning that the room was safer when you understood it before you reacted to it. Then he told her about Gabriel. He told her about the phone, about the message thread, about the 4 days of coordination, the route information, the timing, about the reply he had sent from the captured phone, 1 word, designed to confirm a death that had not occurred, designed to trigger Gabriel's exit from the cathedral before Emilian arrived. He told her that Gabriel had known, from the beginning, what the plan was, that the relationship had been the plan, that the year, all 14 months of it, had been operational, that every question Gabriel had asked about her father's movements, every dinner, every careful, patient accumulation of access and information, had been directional, had been pointed, always, toward this morning. Anastasia was quiet for a long time after he finished. The candle on the vestry table had burned down to a stub. Outside the closed door, the cathedral was a low murmur of voices, the guests finally beginning to move, to talk, to process collectively what they had witnessed. "He was never," she started. "No," Emilian said. She absorbed this. "The ring," she said. "The family ring. Her father had given it because Gabriel had made himself the kind of man a father gives his daughter's ring to. The kind of man who earns that specific trust through the patient, deliberate performance of being exactly what is required at every moment." "Yes," Emilian said. "A year," she said. Not to him, to herself, or to the year itself, measuring it, pressing it, testing the weight of it now that she knew what it had been made of. Emilian said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that specific sentence, and he understood it. She looked at him then directly, with the full clarity of someone who has arrived on the other side of shock and is now simply inhabiting the truth, however cold and however complete. "My father," she said. "He needs to hear. Does he know that I—" "He knows," Emilian said. "He asked me to tell you he's sorry you were in this room without him." Something crossed Anastasia's face that was not grief and not relief, but the complicated, private expression of a daughter who knows her father would carry guilt about this for longer than was reasonable and cannot stop him from doing so. "Can I see him?" she said. Yes. She stood. She smoothed the front of her wedding dress not from vanity, not from habit, but the automatic gesture of a person preparing to be seen by someone they love, wanting to present themselves with dignity regardless of the circumstances. At the vestry door she stopped, her hand on the frame. He did it for a year, she said, without turning. Every day for a year he sat at the table and asked my father questions, and drove me home, and said the right things, and none of it. She stopped, pressed her palm flat against the doorframe. None of it was ever real. Emilian looked at her back, at the lace of the dress, and the set of her shoulders, and the particular stillness of a person who is holding something enormous and has decided, quietly, to hold it standing up. Real or not, he said, your father is alive. She was still for a moment. Then she opened the door and walked out. Nikolai was sitting up when Anastasia arrived. The vehicle was parked in the cathedral's rear courtyard, a quiet, stone-walled square that the guests couldn't see from the main entrance, accessed through the side gate that the priest had opened without being asked. Because the priest had been quietly and efficiently helpful all morning, in the way that people sometimes are when events have moved beyond ceremony into something that requires a different kind of grace. The medical team had done their work. The cut above Nikolai's eyebrow had been closed 3 neat sutures, and a dressing that he had already touched twice and been told twice not to touch. His color was back. His jacket was folded on the seat beside him, the left shoulder dark where the bleeding had reached it before it was managed, and he was sitting with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the courtyard gate, with the expression he always wore when he was waiting for something he could not control. When the gate opened and Anastasia walked through it, something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not with the visible collapse of a man overwhelmed. Nikolai did not collapse visibly. It was not in his architecture. But something that had been held tightly in his jaw and his shoulders released by degrees, a gradual unlocking, and his eyes, when they found her, had the quality of a man who has been running a terrible calculation in his head for the past hour and has just been handed the answer that makes all the other numbers irrelevant. She crossed the courtyard in her wedding dress and sat beside him in the open vehicle door and put her arms around him without saying anything, and he held her with the careful, deliberate pressure of a man acutely aware of his own injury and completely unwilling to let it reduce the hold. They stayed that way for a while. The courtyard was quiet. A bird moved somewhere in the stone eaves. The distant sound of the cathedral's interior voices, movement, the slow dispersal of 93 people processing an extraordinary morning filtered through the walls as something low and indistinct. I'm sorry, Nikolai said eventually, into her hair. Don't, she said. Anastasia, don't, she said again. Firmer, the voice of a daughter who has inherited her father's directness and is using it on him. You're here. That's the only thing. He was quiet for a moment. The ring, he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. She had taken the ring off in the vestry. She didn't remember doing it, only realized afterward that it was gone from her finger, and had found it in her palm when she opened her hand in the courtyard. She looked at it now. A small, plain band, old gold, the kind of ring that carried the weight of its history in its simplicity. She pressed it into her father's hand and closed his fingers around it. He looked down at his closed fist for a long moment. I gave it to him, he said. Not self-recrimination. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who is precise about his own errors. You gave it to the person you believed he was, Anastasia said. That's different. Nikolai looked at her steadily. You sound, he said, like someone who has already decided to be all right. I've decided to start from there, she said. It's not the same thing. He nodded slowly. He understood the distinction. He had made similar decisions in difficult rooms over many years, and he knew the difference between the decision to be all right and the long, uneven work of actually getting there. He knew she had a great deal of that work ahead of her. He also knew, with the certainty of a man who had watched her become who she was, that she would do it with the same quality she had brought to everything difficult in her life, not without pain, but without surrender. He pulled her back into his arms. She let him. Emilian handled the remainder. This was not a decision that was discussed or delegated. It was simply the natural order of how things worked between them. Nikolai protected what was his, and Emilian handled what protection required, and neither man found it necessary to draw the line between these two responsibilities, because neither had ever been unclear about where it ran. He spent 3 days after the wedding in a kind of focused, unhurried motion that his team recognized and oriented themselves around, without requiring briefing. Meetings in rooms that weren't on any schedule. Conversations conducted at hours that assumed the other party was awake because they were always awake. The patient, methodical dismantling of a structure that had taken longer to build than it took to take apart, because structures built on secrecy have a fundamental weakness, which is that the secrecy itself, once compromised, removes the protection from everything underneath. Gabriel gave them the organization within the first 6 hours, not because he wanted to, because Emilian sat across from him in a quiet room, with the phone on the table between them, and asked 3 questions in the specific sequence that made the 4th question unnecessary, and Gabriel understood, with the clarity of a genuinely intelligent man who had run out of positions, that the negotiation available to him was not whether to give the information, but what he received in exchange for it. He gave them names, locations, the financial architecture of the operation, and the 3 men at the top of it who had designed the plan and selected Gabriel and decided that the most efficient route to Nikolai ran through his daughter's heart. Emilian thanked him for his cooperation in the flat, procedural tone of a man for whom gratitude was simply an acknowledgement of received data. Then he stood and left the room, and made the calls that needed to be made. Within 72 hours, the organization had ceased to function in any meaningful sense. Not loudly, not in the way that makes news or requires official involvement. In the quiet, permanent way of something that has been taken apart at its foundations. The specific kind of ending that leaves no structure for anyone to rebuild from. The 3 men at the top were dealt with personally. Emilian did not delegate this. 2 weeks after the morning that was supposed to be a wedding, Anastasia visited her father at the estate. She found him in his study, the amber-lit room with the cedar smell and the bookshelves and the desk lamp that had been the center of her understanding of him since childhood. He was reading, or had been reading. The book closed on the desk in front of him in the way of a man who had stopped reading some time ago, and had not yet decided what to do instead. She sat across from him. They talked for a long time about things that needed to be said and things that didn't need to be said but were said anyway. Because the morning had opened certain rooms between them that had previously been navigated around, and walking back past them without acknowledging they existed would have required a dishonesty that neither of them was built for. At some point, Anastasia asked about Emilian. Not about what he had done, she knew what he had done. About him, the man. The friend who had driven 8 minutes in 5, who had walked into that cathedral and looked at Gabriel across 40 meters of stone floor, with the expression of someone who had already decided how things ended. Nikolai was quiet for a moment. He's not an easy man to know, he said. I know, Anastasia said. Nikolai looked at her with the measuring quality he brought to things that required care. He asked about you, he said. Afterward, Anastasia said nothing. He asked if you were all right, Nikolai said. Once. He won't ask again, it's not how he is. He'll wait to know. Anastasia looked at the closed book on her father's desk. At the ring back on his little finger where it belonged. At the dressing above his eyebrow, smaller now, the sutures already dissolving. She thought about a man walking through white light into a cathedral without asking the space for permission. About the word done sent to a phone from a road beside a river to trigger a groom's exit and instead trigger his capture. About the specific quality of eyes that find you across a room and tell you, without words, without performance, that whatever is happening, you are not in it alone. I know he won't ask again, she said. She stood, smoothed the front of her jacket, looked at her father with the expression she wore when she had decided something, and was not yet ready to say what it was. Tell him, she said, that I'm starting from all right. Nikolai looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that reached everything, the eyes, the set of the shoulders, the particular unlocking of a man who had spent a great deal of his life in careful stillness and was, in this moment, simply a father watching his daughter decide to keep going. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.